Just to clarify, because I can't go back and delete things, we don't have this exact same Sedition and Espionage Act today. We do have an Espionage Act, but we don't have the same types of limitations on freedom of speech. That was potentially very confusing. We can talk about that more in class. Meanwhile, the Allies do win the war. Russia, who had been our ally, remember, had withdrawn and made peace with Germany in March of 1918. You might remember that they were having their own communist revolution, and that is going to end the war then on that front. So Germany had an advantage at that point because they could send all their troops to the Western Front, and they were no longer fighting a war on two fronts, on the Western Front and the Eastern Front, because remember, they're sandwiched right there in the middle, which is a really bad spot. It's going to end up being a problem in World War II as well. In the Second Battle of the Marne, the Germans actually almost made it to Paris, but the German men and supplies were exhausted on the way to the Marne. The Allies had 140,000 fresh American troops, 350 tanks. We were able to win that battle, and it turned the tide of the war. The German people actually are going to mutiny and kick out Kaiser Wilhelm II, and at the same time, the Central Powers crumbled. The Bulgarians, the Ottomans, and the Austria-Hungarians decided that they were done with the war, that they had lost. They could no longer go forward. And then when Germany surrendered, that was it. So on November 11th, 1918, the war ended. In sum, 10 to 15 million people died. That is an enormous number. But look at how many Americans, only about 116,000. So we had a really small contribution to the war in terms of men. We had given a lot more money. 20 million people were injured or wounded. That includes civilians. That is a staggering number. The total cost of the war is $500 billion. That's today's money. Germany is going to be forced to pay that cost, and they actually did not finish paying it until a few years ago. The economy of Europe was completely destroyed. Industry, farms, cities, there was nothing left. The United States then is going to be in a key position to continue on as the key manufacturer because we're really the only economy that was booming at this time. And on January of 1918, Wilson had issued his 14 points. So this is before actually the war even ended. He had a plan for lasting peace. He wanted to make the world safe for democracy. And his goal was to see self-determination for all countries. So instead of that whole being imperialized or colonialized by someone else, it was up to the people to decide the government that they wanted. And his other goal was to create an international peacekeeping body. Now, this is going to turn into the League of Nations, but remember how we talked about part of his vision for the world was world peace, and he believes he's going to do this through this international peacekeeping body. So the war officially ended in 1918, and it was called the Armistice, which was a temporary end to fighting or a truce, and we're going to have another Paris Peace Conference. So the call goes out and the world leaders attend. The key players are going to be George Clemenceau from France, and he was called the Tiger because he wanted the most, he wanted Germany to suffer, and he was very fierce about it. And France had especially suffered at the hands of the Germans. Most of the fighting had been done in France because of their location. Woodrow Wilson, remember, he wants peace. He's the idealist. And then we had David Lloyd George from Great Britain, and he was all about balance. He didn't think that we should punish Germany too much, but he didn't want Germany to get off the hook entirely. And then we also had Vittorio Orlando from Italy. He is going to be a player as well, but he's going to get very, very frustrated because the things that Italy is going to be promised aren't going to come through, the territory that they wanted. The Treaty of Versailles will be signed at this Paris Peace Conference. It will be, so take a look at your handout there, it will be extremely harsh on Germany. It will include a guilt clause where they have to admit that the war was all of their fault. We know that this is a bit ridiculous. It wasn't all of Germany's fault. They will be forced to pay all of the reparations for the war. In other words, they will be essentially signing a blank check. They will lose their army, so they will only be allowed to keep a tiny little navy and a tiny army. They lose all their colonies. The portion of it's called the Rhineland, its territory between Germany and France, will be demilitarized. In other words, that's going to try to create a buffer zone between France and Germany. In addition, there's going to be the creation of an independent Poland. This is a huge step. The people of Poland wanted to be their own country, so we have some self-determination there. France regains some of her territory that she had actually lost in a previous war against Germany, and they would create the League of Nations. So this was Wilson's idea. So go to your worksheet right now. Be sure to add the League of Nations onto your list. So here's what Europe is going to look like after World War II. You can see some of the changes here, this demilitarized zone, and the new creation here of Poland. So the League of Nations is set out to be an international peacekeeping association. The key members, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Germany will not be allowed, and neither will Russia. So remember, Germany because Germany, and then Russia because they're now communist, and we have anti-communist sentiment rising in the world. It would consist of 32 allied and neutral nations, and the idea here would be collective security, an international peacekeeping body instead of a balance of power based on alliances. So instead you would all join this organization instead of countries going into individual treaties with each other that were often secretive, that had gotten us into the disaster of World War II. This sort of idea of collective security, that all nations of the world will have to unite in action to stop any aggressor nation. The first test will come in the beginning of World War II. It will be a complete disaster. Today, from the League of Nations, we have the United Nations. But there's a problem. The United States doesn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles. So remember, even if the president signs a treaty abroad, it has to be ratified by Congress because of how we have our separation of powers. And there are going to be a tremendous amount of political differences between the Republicans and the Democrats at this time. It's that same old struggle that we saw at the end of the Civil War, where Lincoln was starting to struggle with Congress, and then we all remember presidential versus congressional reconstruction under Johnson. So that same end of war struggle of who is going to be the decider here. And we're going to have a group called the reservationists. In other words, they are people who have reservations or concerns about the treaty. And they are led by the Republican Henry Cabot Lodge. He and Wilson just really hated each other. Then we have the irreconcilables, and they were against the treaty no matter what. So the reservationists had concerns and were willing to make accommodations, but the irreconcilables absolutely would never, ever, ever, ever be okay with any type of Treaty of Versailles. They were 100% opposed to it. Unfortunately, at this time, President Wilson suffered a stroke. He was pretty much incapacitated as president. He was unwilling to make concessions. It did change his personality a bit. Things that he might have compromised on, he was no longer willing to compromise on. So historians now think some of that was from these health issues. But if you look at your chart and you see there's going to be opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, but if you see there were 39 Democrats who were pro-treaty, then you had mild reservationists, so people who had mild concerns, strong reservationists, who some Republicans, including Lodge, and then the irreconcilables who were completely against it. The number of senators were 96. We needed 64 to ratify. The number of senators who actually wanted the treaty in some form was 81. So if there could have been a deal passed here, and it was an opportunity that just didn't come together. Some of these reasons that it didn't come together, some of the resistance was the idea, this is not fair to Germany. The guilt clause, which was Article 231, is so mean. It's not based on the 14 points. It's not what we signed up to do. It's just wrong. The other was the worry that the League of Nations would negate the Constitution. If we joined up with this League of Nations, could it force the United States to do something that was unconstitutional or that America did not like? Another worry, that the United States would become the policeman of the world and have to send troops everywhere and be super involved. We all know how that one ended. This is going to lead to the road to World War II. Germans are humiliated and they want revenge. There's also going to be disillusionment in the United States because of this treaty. Hey, this is not what we signed up to do. Also, we created the League of Nations, it was our idea, and we're not even going to join it. How hypocritical is that? Lingering economics and political problems in Europe are going to lead some countries, Germany, Italy, to embrace dictatorships because of their huge economic problems. And these overall economic difficulties are going to contribute to the worldwide depression that lasted from 1929 to 1939. Subject nationalities, there's still going to be minority groups living in sort of proto-imperialist nations that aren't going to have all the rights that they'd wanted. So ultimately, we're disillusioned, and we really feel like, hey, we said that the world was safe for democracy, but it's clearly not. We're going to have these dictators rising, the economies are hurting, and this is going to enter us into this real era of disillusionment and confusion. We're feeling like, we fought all this, but why did we even fight it? Why did this even happen? And I will leave you on that note. Please write down all your questions, bring them into class. We will go over them before I give you your quiz. That will be 2 short answer questions. Thanks. Have a good weekend.